The night Clark Ashford rode into the cattle camp outside of Abilene, Kansas, every man around the fire went quiet in the particular way that men do when they recognize something dangerous and cannot decide whether to run from it or simply pretend it is not there. It was the spring of 1873, and the Chisholm Trail was alive with the sounds and smells that had come to define that wild corridor of American ambition. 10,000 longhorns lowing in the darkness, the sharp scent of horse sweat and wood smoke, the distant howl of a coyote threading through the flat grasslands like a needle through old cloth. The drovers of the Caldwell outfit had made their camp in a wide bend along Mud Creek, and they were comfortable men, trail-hardened men, men who had seen their share of dust storms and river crossings, and the occasional dispute that ended with someone lying in the dirt. They were not easily unnerved, but Clark Ashford unnerved them. He came in on a dark bay gelding, riding with the kind of unhurried ease that suggested he had nowhere particular to be and nothing particular to fear. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from limestone, and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a hard freeze, pale gray, almost silver and entirely unreadable. He wore a battered brown duster that had seen more miles than most men's entire lives, and he carried himself with the specific quiet that belongs to men who have learned that silence is cheaper than words and considerably more effective. He did not ask permission to make camp on the edge of their fire. He simply dismounted, saw to his horse with practiced efficiency, and settled himself on a flat rock a little apart from the rest of the group, his tin cup balanced on one knee, his eyes on the flames. The Caldwell outfit's trail boss, a thick-necked man named Holt Briggs, leaned toward one of his drovers and said something in a low voice. The drover, a young fellow named Pete Saunders, nodded tightly and did not look in Clark's direction again. Nobody did, not directly. They spoke among themselves in the slightly too loud voices of men who are working hard at seeming unconcerned, and they gave the far side of the fire a wide berth. This was how it had been for Clark Ashford for the better part of 3 years. He had ridden through enough camps, enough cow towns, enough dusty frontier settlements to know the pattern by now. Word traveled fast on the trail, faster than horses sometimes, carried in the whispers between drovers who met at river crossings or shared water at the same scarce wells. His name had its own particular weight, its own particular shadow, and he had stopped trying to outrun it. You could not outrun a story. He had learned that lesson at considerable cost. What he had not expected, on this particular night in this particular camp, was her. Mary Finley arrived at the edge of the firelight roughly an hour after Clark had settled in, and she arrived the way people arrive when they are accustomed to making their own way in the world without ceremony, without apology, and without any apparent awareness that her presence might be unexpected. She was driving a small covered wagon, a modest prairie schooner pulled by 2 sturdy mules that she handled with the practiced authority of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. She pulled up alongside the camp, set the brake with a firm hand, climbed down from the seat with her skirts tucked sensibly around her boots, and walked directly toward Holt Briggs. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark chestnut hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had been repaired at least twice and showed it honestly. Her face was what people in that era and those circumstances would have called handsome rather than pretty, strong-featured, sun-browned, with dark eyes that moved quickly and missed nothing. She was not a fragile woman. There was nothing fragile about her at all. She wore a plain brown traveling dress and a canvas jacket, and she carried herself with a directness that was somewhat uncommon for women in 1873 and entirely characteristic of her specifically. "I am traveling to Caldwell," she told Holt Briggs without preamble, "and I would appreciate the use of your fire tonight and your company as far as the trail allows. I can contribute provisions for the morning meal, and I am not afraid of hard work. My name is Mary Finley." Holt Briggs, who was not an unkind man but was a practical one, looked at her wagon, looked at her mules, and then looked at the woman herself with the evaluating gaze of someone calculating risk and benefit simultaneously. "You traveling alone, Miss Finley?" he asked. "I am," she said, without elaboration or apology. Briggs scratched the back of his neck. "Trail's not entirely safe for a woman alone." "I am aware of that," Mary said. "I have been on it for 11 days. I am still here." Something almost like respect crossed Briggs's broad face. He gestured toward the fire. "Make yourself at home, then. Boys, make room." The drovers shuffled and made room, and Mary went about the business of unhitching her mules with the same efficient competence with which she had done everything else. The men watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and admiration, and there was some talk and some laughter, and the general easing of atmosphere that happens when a capable, pleasant woman joins a group of men who have been in each other's company for too long. She was the one who noticed Clark Ashford sitting apart. The others had unconsciously arranged themselves so that their backs were largely to him, but Mary, settling onto a log with her tin plate of beans and salt pork, looked around the fire with the frank curiosity of a woman who considered people one of the more interesting things the world had to offer. Her gaze moved from face to face and came to rest, finally, on the solitary figure across the flames. He was staring into the fire. He had not spoken to anyone. The space around him was empty in a deliberate way, the way a wide berth is always deliberate, and he seemed entirely untroubled by it, as if he had grown so accustomed to his own solitude that he had stopped noticing the shape of it. Mary Finley studied him for a long moment. Then she stood, crossed to the other side of the fire, and sat down on a flat stone perhaps 4 feet from where he sat. He looked up. His eyes, catching the firelight, were exactly the color she had thought from a distance, pale and still and very watchful, the eyes of a man who had learned to read situations quickly because the failure to do so had consequences. "You look like you have a story," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture and weight. Somewhere out in the dark, a longhorn groaned low and mournful. The fire crackled and sent a shower of sparks upward into the black Kansas sky. Clark Ashford looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough that most people would have grown uncomfortable and retreated. Mary did not retreat. "Most people do," he said finally. His voice was low, and it had a quality she would later try to describe to herself, measured, she decided, as if he chose each word with some care before releasing it. "Most people do," she agreed, "but most people don't make a whole camp rearrange itself without saying a word." His jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger, she thought, something more like acknowledgement. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know you," she replied. "It seems early to be afraid." Something moved in his expression then, small and quick, there and gone before she could name it. He looked back at the fire. "Clark Ashford," he said. "Mary Finley," she replied. And that, against all expectation and against most ordinary logic, was how it began. She did not press him that first night. She sat beside him for a while and spoke of small, easy things, the condition of the trail, the strange beauty of the Kansas grasslands at dusk, the reliability of her mules, whom she had named Augustine and Jerome after 2 saints whose stories she found both instructive and vaguely amusing. He listened more than he spoke, which she did not find troubling. She was a woman who had learned to be comfortable with silence, had in fact come to appreciate it in the same way one appreciates weather, as something honest, as something that tells the truth about a place and a moment in a way that constant noise cannot. When she said good night and made her way to her wagon, she felt his eyes follow her across the camp with a particular quality of attention that she carried with her into sleep. The drovers left early the next morning, thundering south with their herd in the gray pre-dawn light. Clark Ashford had his horse saddled before most of the others were up, and Mary had her mules harnessed and her wagon ready with the same quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything she did. She did not ask him if he was heading the same direction. She simply climbed onto her seat and clicked to Augustine and Jerome, and when she passed him on the trail he fell in beside her without either of them discussing it. They rode in silence for perhaps 2 miles. The sun came up behind them, painting the prairie gold and amber, and the grass rolled in the morning wind like something breathing. "Where are you from originally?" she asked, because silence at 2 miles was comfortable but silence at 20 would be a choice, and she wanted to understand which kind they were choosing. "Texas," he said. "Born outside of San Marcos. You?" "Missouri," she said. "A town called Boonville on the Missouri River. Though I've been moving west for 2 years now." "Moving toward something or away?" She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the trail ahead, but she could tell the question was genuine, not idle. "Both," she said honestly. "My husband died in the winter of '71, fever. We had come out to Kansas together to start fresh, and when he was gone I found I still wanted the fresh start, just differently." Something in his posture shifted at this, the slight softening that happens when unexpected honesty is offered and received. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your husband." "Thank you," she said. "His name was Thomas. He was a good man. The fever took him in 4 days and there wasn't anything to be done about it." She paused. "What are you riding toward, if you don't mind my asking?" "North," he said. "I heard there's ranching work up around Ellsworth that doesn't come with too many questions." "Work that doesn't come with questions," she said. "That tells me something." He looked at her then, directly, and for a moment she thought he was going to close down entirely, the way men do when they decide they've allowed too much access. But he didn't. "The story you said I had," he said. "I imagine you're wondering what it is." "I am," she said. "But I'll wait until you want to tell it. Stories keep." He was quiet for another mile. Then he said, "3 years ago I was riding with the Beaumont outfit. They were running a trail from Texas up through the Indian Territory, and there was a dispute, a bad one, between the trail boss and some Comanche men who had a legitimate complaint about the cattle being run across their land without any compensation or agreement. The trail boss wasn't interested in settling it fairly. He was going to handle it with guns." He stopped. "And," she said. "And I was the only man in that outfit who thought that was wrong," he said. "I said so, loudly. I rode between the trail boss and those men, and I told Beaumont that he was about to make a murderous mistake and that I wanted no part of it." "What happened?" "2 men on our side fired anyway," he said. "Before anything could be settled, there was a fight." His voice was steady but careful. "3 men died, 2 Comanche, 1 of ours. And after it was over, Beaumont told anyone who would listen that I had fired first to start it. That I had provoked the whole thing for reasons nobody could quite explain." He paused again. "It wasn't true, but he was a man with money and connections, and I was not, and on the frontier that tends to settle the question." Mary was quiet for a long moment, watching the trail unwind ahead of them. "And so you've been carrying that story ever since," she said. "Everywhere I ride," he confirmed. "Cowboys talk, word gets around. And you never cleared your name." "A man with no money and no connections doesn't have a great many tools available for clearing his name," he said, with a flatness that was not bitterness exactly, but something adjacent to it. "The particular resignation of a man who has thought through the available options and found them all wanting. That is a terrible injustice," she said plainly. He looked at her again, and this time what moved across his face was surprise, the genuine kind, the kind that cannot be performed. "Most people," he said carefully, "assume there's no smoke without fire. Most people," she said, "haven't spent much time actually looking at what starts fires." He didn't answer that, but something in him seemed to settle, the way a horse settles when a hand it has been braced against suddenly becomes gentle. They rode into a town called Harper's Crossing by midday, a small settlement with a general store, a livery, a saloon, and a church whose whitewash was already peeling in the Kansas wind. Mary needed provisions, cornmeal, salt, lamp oil, and Clark needed to replace a loose shoe on his gelding, which he'd been monitoring for the last 10 miles with the attentiveness of a man who knows that a lame horse on the open prairie is a serious problem. The farrier was a stocky man named Gus Holloway, who worked with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing one thing well for a very long time. And while he worked, Clark stood with his gelding and watched the street with eyes that never quite stopped moving. Mary came out of the general store with her provisions in a canvas sack and paused beside him. "Your horse has a good temperament," she said, looking at the gelding. "His name is Cannon," Clark said. "Short for Cannonball. He came that way. Does he live up to it? When he needs to, a pause. He's a good horse. Better than I deserve, probably." "Don't do that," she said. He looked at her. "Diminish yourself," she said. "It's a habit. I can see it's a habit. You don't have to." His jaw worked for a moment. "You say things straight out," he said. "Most people don't." "Most people find it easier not to," she agreed. "I find it easier to. We're just different, most people and me." She adjusted the strap of her canvas sack on her shoulder. "I'm making dinner tonight at camp. You're welcome to eat." She walked back to her wagon before he could form a response, which may have been intentional. The camp that night was quieter than the one before, just the two of them, settled in a hollow off the main trail where a stand of cottonwoods gave some shelter, and a small creek provided water for the animals. Mary made a proper meal, not the rough trail food of beans and dried meat that characterized most camp cooking, but something that smelled genuinely good. A stew with the salt pork she'd bought in Harper's Crossing and dried vegetables reconstituted in the pot, with cornbread made in her cast iron skillet over the fire. Clark ate with the concentrated focus of a man who hadn't had a real meal in longer than he would admit, and Mary watched him with the kind of quiet attention she gave to most things she found interesting. "Tell me about Missouri," he said, when the first urgency of hunger had eased. So she did. She told him about Boonville on the river, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had been the kind of woman who could make any space feel like home within an hour of arriving in it. She told him about growing up with two brothers who had taught her to ride and to fish and to argue effectively, and how those skills had proven considerably more useful in the long run than the needlepoint her aunts had tried to teach her. She told him about Thomas Finley, who had been a quiet, steady man with large hands and a great talent for carpentry, and how they had been married for 3 years before the fever came. She told him about the particular grief of being left behind in a strange place, and how she had sat in her small Kansas cabin for 3 months and cried, and then woken up one morning and decided that she was 31 miles from the woman she intended to become and needed to start moving. "Where are you going in Caldwell?" he asked. "I have a cousin there," she said. "Edna Marsh. She and her husband have a small ranch. They've invited me to stay while I figure out what comes next." "Do you know what comes next?" "Not specifically," she said. "I know the direction." "What direction?" She looked up at the stars, which were extraordinary out here, away from any town's lamplight, a thick wash of white across the dark sky that never failed to make her feel both small and oddly comforted. "Something that's mine," she said. "Land, maybe. I've been saving for 2 years. Thomas left me the cabin and a small sum, and I've been careful with it. If there's suitable land near Caldwell, I'd like to have a place." She looked back at him. "A person needs a place." "Yes," he said. It came out with a weight that she recognized as personal. "Do you have one, a place?" "Not in a long time," he said. "What was the last one?" It was quiet for a moment, but not the closing down kind of quiet this time. The thinking kind. "San Marcos," he said finally. "My family had 40 acres, nothing much, but it was ours. My father built the house himself. I was 12 when we lost it, drought and bad luck and debt, the usual story. My father died the year after. My mother went to live with her sister in San Antonio." He paused. "I've been a hired man ever since, working other people's land, building other people's herds." "How old are you?" she asked. 27, he said. 15 years of not having a place," she said softly. "I stopped wanting one after a while," he said. "It's easier." "I don't believe that," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I don't mean that unkindly," she said. "I just mean you're a man who knows what he lost. You don't forget that kind of knowing, you just learn to carry it differently." The fire popped and settled. Somewhere in the cottonwoods an owl called and then was silent. "Mary Finley," he said very quietly, "you are the most direct person I have ever met. Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It is decidedly not a complaint." In the morning, he helped her hitch Augustine and Jerome without being asked, moving around the mules with the comfortable ease of a man who had worked with animals his whole life. Jerome, who was particular about strangers, stood calmly under his hands, and Mary noticed this with the attention she gave to such things. Animals, she had found, were good judges of character, sometimes better than people. They traveled south through the warming May day, the prairie spreading around them in all directions, the sky enormous and blue and alive with clouds moving in long processions from the northwest. They talked more easily now, the slight formality of the first day having dissolved somewhere in the previous night's honesty, and Mary found that Clark Ashford, when he was willing to speak, was a man of considerable intelligence and dry wit, and a quality of observation that she found genuinely interesting. He told her about the rivers he'd crossed on the trail, the Red, the Canadian, the Cimarron, and described them with the precision of someone who had learned that rivers were not constant, but were instead entirely themselves in any given moment, and that the difference between crossing safely and coming to grief was nearly always a matter of whether you respected that fact. He told her about the stars navigated by, about the particular behavior of longhorns in a thunderstorm, about the way the Indian Territory changed as you moved through it, the rolling red hills, the deep green river bottoms, the thin blue line of mountains on the western horizon. She told him about the books she carried in her wagon. She had 4, which was more than most people on the trail had, and considerably fewer than she would have preferred. She had a worn Bible, a copy of Mr. Dickens's Great Expectations, a botanical guide to the plants of the American prairie, and a small journal in which she wrote every evening, a practice she had maintained since she was 16 years old. "What do you write about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "What I saw, what I thought, what I felt, what seemed important." She paused. "I wrote about you last night." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "That you were a man carrying a weight he hadn't chosen and hadn't put down," she said, "and that I thought underneath it you were probably someone worth knowing." He looked straight ahead at the trail for a long time. "I don't know if that's true," he said quietly. "I have reasonable judgment," she said. "I trust it." The land began to change as they moved south, the flat grasslands developing a slight roll, low hills beginning to suggest themselves on the horizon. They passed through 2 small settlements and a river crossing that required Clark to go in first to test the depth and bottom, coming back with water to his stirrups, and a report that it was passable if they kept to the shallower line to the right. Mary drove her wagon through without hesitation, keeping her mules on the line he had indicated, and he rode beside her in case anything went wrong. Nothing did. That night they camped on a broad plain, and a storm came up from the south after dark. Not a violent one, but a steady, determined rain that beat on the top of Mary's wagon and turned the trail to mud. Clark had erected a modest linta with his canvas ground sheet and some sticks, but the rain was coming in sideways and it was largely ineffective, and after 20 minutes he was simply wet. Mary opened the back of her wagon. "Come in out of the rain," she said. "There's room." He hesitated. "I'm not proposing anything improper," she said with a particular dry patience. "I am proposing that you not sit in the rain when there is a wagon 10 feet away." He came in. The wagon was not large, but it was organized with the careful economy of someone who had been living in it for weeks. A bedroll on one side, her trunk on the other, the provisions neatly stacked along the center, and the small space between smelling of canvas and wood smoke and the faint dried herb scent of the botanical guide she'd pressed things between. He sat on the trunk and she sat on the edge of her bedroll, and the rain hammered the canvas overhead with a sound that was, he thought, surprisingly peaceful. "Tell me something good," she said. "Something good that you remember." He thought about it. "When I was about 8, he said, "my father took me out to the far corner of our property, the 40 acres, at night. There was a particular rise there where you could see a long way in every direction. He said, 'All of this is ours and it goes all the way to the horizon and someday it'll be yours.' I knew even then it wasn't quite accurate. We could see miles more than 40 acres in any direction, but I also knew what he meant. He meant this is our place. We belong here. He stopped. That's a beautiful memory, she said softly. It's the best one I have of him, he said. Then it's a good one to keep, she said. The rain continued, steady and particular, and they talked until the sound of it had become a kind of music, until the conversation had found that comfortable depth where silences are as meaningful as words. She told him about the night her husband had died, quietly and without excessive grief, just the facts of it. The way the fever had climbed, the way the doctor had done what he could, the way Thomas had held her hand until he couldn't any more. She told it with the composure of a woman who has processed grief thoroughly enough that she can carry it gently, without it spilling. He listened with his whole attention the way he did everything, and when she had finished he said he was lucky to have someone beside him. I hope so, she said. That's what I hope. She was quiet for a moment. Do you want to know what I think is the hardest part of losing someone, she said. What? Not the grief, she said. The grief you know how to do eventually. The hardest part is the silence at the end of the day when there is no one to tell the small things to. What you saw, what was funny, what was beautiful. The small things accumulate and there is nowhere to put them. He was very still. Yes, he said, I know something about that. I thought you might, she said. The rain had begun to ease, thinning from a steady pour to a soft patter. Outside, Augustine blew through his nose in the equine expression of mild complaint. You should sleep, she said. I'll stay on my side, you stay on yours. We are two adults in a covered wagon in the rain, and anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to stand outside and have one. Despite himself, he laughed. It was unexpected, not polished or practiced, but entirely genuine. A brief, warm sound that transformed his face completely and made him look, for just a moment, like the young man he actually was beneath all those miles and all that weight. Mary Finley looked at his face when he laughed, and something settled in her chest with the quiet certainty of something finding its right place. She had not looked for this. She had been very clear with herself, in the 2 years since Thomas's death, about what she was doing and what she was not doing. She was building a life. She was moving toward the woman she intended to be. She was not looking for the complication of another heart to tend alongside her own. She had told herself this story very consistently, and she had believed it. But she had also not met Clark Ashford before. In the morning, the world was washed clean and bright, the mud beginning to dry in the warming sun, the grass sparkling with leftover rain. They broke camp with an efficiency that had become comfortable, each knowing without discussion what the other was doing, moving around each other with the unconscious coordination of people whose rhythms have begun to match. They reached Caldwell 2 days later, riding into the growing cattle town in the late afternoon when the streets were busy with drovers and merchants, and the general bustle of a place that was becoming something, not yet what it would be, but visibly on the way. The cattle market was the engine of it, and you could feel that engine running in the purposeful movement of men and animals, in the sound of it, in the particular quality of energy that commerce generates. Mary's cousin Edna Marsh lived 2 miles outside of town proper on a small ranch that ran some cattle and a substantial kitchen garden. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon, a stout, bright-eyed woman about 10 years older than Mary with a generous manner and the kind of laugh that invited other people to join in. She folded Mary into an embrace that was thorough and unself-conscious. You made it, she said. Lord, I was worried. 11 days on the trail alone. 12, Mary said, and I wasn't entirely alone the last part. She looked back at Clark, who had stopped his horse at a polite distance, reading the situation. Edna Marsh looked at him with the frank, evaluating gaze of a woman who has seen a great deal of life. Clark Ashford, Mary said. He rode with me the last 3 days. Clark, this is my cousin Edna Marsh. Ma'am, he said, touching his hat brim. Edna looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then looked at Mary, and something passed between them in the rapid, silent language that belongs to women who know each other well. Will you stay for supper, Mr. Ashford? Edna asked. He glanced at Mary. "Please," Mary said simply. Edna's husband Robert was a quiet, capable rancher with a sun-weathered face and a thorough lack of the kind of opinion that Clark's reputation usually generated. He shook Clark's hand, asked him direct and sensible questions about what kind of work he was looking for, and within the course of supper had mentioned that the Hendricks Ranch, 12 miles north on the Nineska River, was looking for a steady hand for the summer season, and that he could put in a word if Clark was interested. Clark looked across the table at Mary. "I'd be obliged," he said to Robert. Mary's expression did not change, but her eyes did, in the particular way that eyes change when a thought becomes a feeling. He did not leave the next morning. Edna pressed breakfast on him with the cheerful authority of a woman who feeds people the way other people breathe, and Robert had things to do in the far pasture that a second pair of hands would considerably ease, and by noon it had become simply the practical thing for Clark to stay through the day. This logic continued, day by day, with a naturalness that none of them examined too closely. Mary settled into the rhythm of the marsh place with the ease of someone coming to a rest they have earned. She helped Edna with the kitchen garden, which was extensive and impressive, and she took over the twice-weekly bread baking with a competence that delighted Edna and improved the general mood of the household considerably. She wrote in her journal in the evenings, sitting on the porch with the last of the daylight, and sometimes Clark would sit nearby, mending tack or doing some other quiet work, and they would talk or not talk in equal measure, and both seemed equally good. On the 5th day, she walked the 2 miles into town to inquire at the land office about available acreage. Clark saddled Cannon and rode with her, because the road into Caldwell was not perfectly safe, and he had made it his business to know this, and because he found he wanted to, which was a different thing, and one he was still understanding. The land agent in Caldwell was a precise man named Hargrove who had the manner of someone who had dealt with many hopeful people and remained professionally neutral about their hopes. He showed Mary a plat map with various parcels marked in different conditions of availability, and she studied it with the focused attention she gave to everything. There was a parcel of 160 acres, a homestead claim along a tributary of the Nineska, perhaps 8 miles from the marsh place. It had good water, the agent said. The previous claimant had started a cabin and then abandoned the project and gone back east, and the structure was roughly half-finished but sound in its bones. The land was good grassland with a stand of trees along the water. "How much?" Mary asked. The agent told her. She was quiet for a moment, calculating. "I have enough for the claim and the fees," she said. "Not a great deal more." "The cabin would need work," the agent said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I can see it in the picture." She signed the papers that day. Clark witnessed her signature, and when she walked out of the land office into the bright afternoon sunshine, she stopped on the boardwalk and stood still for a moment with her eyes closed and her face tipped slightly up, and he watched her do this and did not say anything because it was a private moment and it was hers. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. "I have land," she said. The words had a quality that he recognized because he had heard it once before in a different voice a long time ago. "This is our place." "Yes," he said, "you do." He rode out to see the parcel with her the following day, and the land agent had not overstated it. The water was good and the grass was good, and the site was beautiful in the particular unadorned way that prairie land is beautiful, wide and honest and alive in the wind. The half-finished cabin was what the agent had said. Sound bones, rough work, needing a great deal of attention. Clark walked through it slowly, running a hand along the framing, checking the fit of the walls. "The foundation is solid," he said. "Whoever started this knew what they were doing with the groundwork. The upper walls need work and there's no roof yet, but the bones are good." "Can it be finished?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He paused, then said, carefully and without looking directly at her, "I have some skill with construction. My father built our house. He taught me." Another pause. "If you want the help." She looked at him for a long moment. "I would be grateful for it," she said, "on the understanding that I am not a woman who sits back and watches other people do her work." "I wouldn't have expected you to be," he said, and so they built it. Through the long, warm days of May, Clark rode out from the Hendricks Ranch where he'd taken the seasonal position, arriving at Mary's land in the early morning with tools and lumber purchased bit by bit from the mill in Caldwell, and they worked side by side through the lengthening days. Mary was as good as her word. She was not a woman who watched. She was a woman who worked, who learned quickly, who asked intelligent questions and executed the answers with precision. She hauled water and mixed mortar and held planks steady and handed up tools and was generally so thoroughly useful that the work went faster than it might have with two men, because the two of them were well matched in their rhythms and their standards. They talked while they worked, the way people do when the work is physical and steady. The talk comes and goes, tied to nothing in particular, free to go anywhere. They talked about Missouri and Texas and the strange, particular beauty of Kansas in the spring. They talked about books. Clark, it turned out, had read considerably more than his circumstances might suggest, having grown up in a household that had few possessions but several books, and having maintained the habit through years of working in houses where books were available if you knew how to ask. He had thoughts about Mr. Dickens that were unexpectedly sophisticated, and they argued about the ending of Great Expectations with a good-natured energy that lasted 3 days and was never quite resolved. They talked about the country itself, what it was becoming, what was being lost in the becoming, the complicated truth of the frontier. Mary, whose father had been an educated man with a conscience as well as a curriculum, had opinions about the injustices being done to the people who had called these plains home for generations. She expressed them plainly, and without the apologetics that many people added to such observations, as if the apology could excuse the ongoing reality of the thing. Clark listened to her with the particular attention of a man who had seen more of these realities up close than most. The incident in the Indian Territory was not the only time he had witnessed the cost of power exercised without conscience. He had seen enough of the frontier's working machinery to understand that the gleaming story told about it and the actual story were not always the same story. "It doesn't mean the land isn't worth loving," he said one evening when they had been talking about this for a while and the conversation had grown serious. "It just means you have to hold both things at once, what it is and what it's done." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." She looked at him with the kind of look that means something has been confirmed. In the evenings, when the work was done and the light was going gold across the grass, they would sometimes sit on the unfinished sill of what would be the cabin's front window and watch the prairie light change, sharing whatever food she had brought for the day. These were easy silences and easy conversations. The space between them had become comfortable in the way that space becomes comfortable between people who have stopped performing and started simply being. He noticed the way she moved, with a practicality that was also somehow graceful, as if competence and elegance were not, in her, mutually exclusive. He noticed the way she thought thoroughly, going all the way around a question before she spoke, which meant that what she said was usually worth hearing. He noticed the way she laughed, not often but genuinely, without self-consciousness, and how it lit her whole face in a way that made the prairie feel less large. She noticed that he had stopped holding himself at the particular careful distance with which he'd begun. That he had let things in small things, the daily small things that you let in when you have begun to trust a place. He smiled more. Not a great deal. He was not a man of constant smiles, but the ones he had were real and they were directed at her, and they made something warm happen in her chest that she had stopped trying to name. The cabin was 3 weeks into construction when the trouble came. It arrived in the form of a man named Wade Beaumont, who was the son of the trail boss Clark had refused, on a Saturday afternoon when Clark was in Caldwell buying supplies and Mary was at her land alone, measuring the window frames. Wade Beaumont was perhaps 25, with his father's square jaw and none of his father's frontier competence. He had the manner of a man who has grown up being told that his name means something and has not developed much beyond it. He came with 2 companions, both armed, and he found Mary on her property because he had been asking around Caldwell about Clark Ashford, and the asking had led him here. Mary heard horses and stepped out of the cabin frame to see them. "Afternoon," she said. "Can I help you?" "You're the woman traveling with Clark Ashford," Wade Beaumont said, not as a question. "I know Mr. Ashford," she said. "This is my property. What is your business here?" He told her his name, which she recognized from Clark's story, and she was aware of a cold clarity settling over her that she associated with situations requiring intelligence rather than force. "What do you want with Mr. Ashford?" she asked. "He has a reputation he's built at my family's expense," Beaumont said. "My father's name is his excuse for everything, but the truth is Ashford's a man who causes trouble and then points blame elsewhere." "That is not my understanding of what happened," Mary said. Beaumont's expression hardened. "I didn't come to debate with a woman. And yet here we are," she said. His jaw tightened. "You tell Ashford that Wade Beaumont is in Caldwell and will be for the week, and that there are things between us that need settling." "I will tell him that you were here," she said. "What is settled and what is not is between the two of you." He stared at her for a moment, clearly having expected something other than this. Then he turned his horse and left, his companions following. Mary stood still until they were out of sight. Then she let out a long, measured breath, picked up her measuring tape, and went back to work. There was nothing useful she could do about Wade Beaumont at this moment, and the window frames needed to be exact or the glass would not fit correctly. She told Clark that evening. He went still in the particular way he did when something significant landed, not rigid but concentrated, all his attention gathering to a single point. "How many men with him?" he asked. "Two," she said. "They were armed, but they didn't handle themselves like they were looking for violence, more like they were trying to seem larger than they were." He thought about this. "What does he want?" she asked. "I don't know exactly," Clark said. "Wade Beaumont has his father's story and his father's grudge, and I don't think he's entirely clear on what he intends to do with them. He's been following me at a distance for 2 years. Following you. Appearing in towns I've been in. I don't think he wants a gunfight. I think he wants, I don't know, a public confrontation maybe, something that proves his father's version." "Then give him the other version," Mary said. He looked at her. "Publicly," she said. "If his business is reputation, then that's where you fight it. The land agent here knows everyone of consequence in this county. Robert Marsh knows people. There are men in this region who were on the trail in 1870 who remember what actually happened. You said yourself that 2 other men fired, not you." "I said that," he agreed. "But saying it and proving it, are you willing to try?" she said. "Or have you carried this so long that you've stopped believing it's worth the carrying?" He was quiet for a long time. The evening was deepening around them, the first stars appearing above the Ninesca bottom. "I don't want trouble to come to your property," he said. "To your land." "This is my land," she said firmly, "and I will decide what is welcome on it and what is not. What I'm asking is about you. Are you willing to try?" He looked at her, at this woman who had sat across a fire from him and refused to be afraid, who had built a cabin beside him and argued about Dickens and said things straight out without apology, who had arrived in his life like a particular kind of weather he had not known he was waiting for. "Yes," he said, "I'm willing to try." Robert Marsh, it turned out, was a man with a long memory and a thorough low opinion of the kind of frontier justice that was operated by money rather than truth. He knew a former Army officer named Hans who had been in the Indian Territory in 1870 and had spoken to men from the Beaumont outfit afterward. He knew a cattle buyer named Pickett who had worked that same trail and who had his own impressions of what had happened on that particular bad day. Clark spent 3 days in Caldwell, not hiding from Wade Beaumont but also not seeking him out, while Robert quietly assembled a picture. What emerged was not a perfect vindication. The frontier did not deal in perfect vindications, but it was something more solid than Clark had had before. There were men willing to say, in the clear company of others, that the story going around about Clark Ashford was not consistent with what they had seen or heard at the time. There was enough to make Wade Beaumont's position uncomfortable. On the third day, Wade Beaumont found Clark in the main street of Caldwell, and the confrontation that followed was watched by perhaps 20 people. Beaumont said his piece, his father's version of events, delivered with the conviction of someone who has heard a story enough times that he believes it completely. Clark let him finish. Then he spoke, quietly and without anger, in the specific language of a man who is telling the truth and knows it. He named the men who had fired. He named the witnesses who had been there. He stated, flatly and without drama, that he had not fired his weapon on that day, that he had in fact been between the two groups attempting to prevent what happened. Several men in the gathered crowd nodded. One of them, the former Army officer, spoke up and said that what Ashford had said was consistent with what he'd heard from men who were there. Wade Beaumont stared at Clark for a long moment. He was not a bad man, Mary thought, watching from the edge of the crowd. He was a young man who had been given a story and had built his anger on it, and he was now watching the ground of that anger shift. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. But he mounted his horse and rode out of Caldwell that afternoon, and his two companions went with him, and the particular cloud that had been following Clark Ashford for 3 years began, very slowly, to thin. Clark came to find her when it was done. She was at her cabin site because the weather was good and there was work to do, and she looked up from the doorframe she was setting when she heard Cannon's hooves on the dry ground. He dismounted. His face was doing something complicated that she gave him a moment to sort out. "It won't all go away at once," he said. "No," she agreed. "These things don't, but it's a start." "It wouldn't have happened without you," he said. "Yes, it would," she said. "Eventually, you would have come to the point of it eventually." "I don't know that," he said. "I do," she said. He was standing very close now, closer than he had stood before except in the rain when they were in the wagon together, and she was aware of the proximity in a way that was not uncomfortable at all but was very specific. "Mary," he said. "Clark," she said. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, tried again. "I have not had much practice with—" Stopped again. "Clark," she said gently, "you talk to me better than anyone I've known. Say the thing." He looked at her, and in his pale gray eyes there was something she had been watching gather for weeks, like weather building, like a river rising. "I don't want to leave," he said. "When the Hendricks contract is done, when the cabin is finished, when there is no longer a practical reason to stay." He stopped. "I don't want to go." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. "Then don't," she said. "It's not—" He exhaled. "I should say this properly. I don't know what I have to offer. I have a horse and a wage and a name that's spent 3 years being." "Your name is Clark Ashford," she said, "and it is the name of a man who rode between an angry trail boss and a group of men he had no reason to protect because he thought it was wrong, and who lost 3 years of his life for it. That is what your name means to me." He was still. "I am not looking to be rescued," she said clearly. "I have my own land and my own plans and my own capable self. But I am also a woman who has spent 2 years trying to convince herself she isn't lonely when she is, and I am tired of that particular argument." She paused. "I am saying I want you to stay, if that's what you're asking." "That's what I'm asking," he said. She held out her hand, work-roughened and strong, and he took it. His hand was large and warm, and it held hers like something he intended to keep. And they stood in the unfinished doorframe of her cabin on the Kansas prairie in the afternoon sun, and neither of them needed to say anything else for a while. He proposed to her formally 6 weeks later, on a Sunday evening in late June, standing in the finished cabin. They had put the roof on 3 weeks previous, and the floor and the window panes a week after that. And it was a solid, honest structure that smelled of fresh-cut timber and already felt like what it was. He had thought carefully about how to do it, had rejected several approaches, and had finally decided that the only way that would be right for Mary Finley was the direct one. He had bought a ring in Caldwell, a small thing, a thin gold band with a single small garnet, modest by any standard but chosen with care. He held it in his hand and said what he meant, which was that he loved her, that he had been falling in love with her since she sat across a fire, and said he looked like he had a story, that he wanted to build something with her on this land she had claimed, and that he intended to be worth the trust she had placed in him. She had listened to every word with her full attention, and then she said, "Yes, absolutely yes," and took the ring from his hand and put it on herself, because that was the kind of woman she was, and he laughed, and it was the warm sound that had first made her certain. They were married in September of 1873 in the small church in Caldwell, whose whitewash had been recently refreshed, with Edna and Robert Marsh as witnesses, and a handful of people who had come to know Clark over the summer season. The minister was a thin man with a large voice and a genuine feeling for ceremony, and he read the words that have been read at the joining of people since there have been people to join. And Clark and Mary Finley, who became Mary Ashford on that September afternoon, looked at each other when they made their promises with the clear eyes of people who know what they are promising. Edna cried. Robert shook Clark's hand with a grip that communicated both welcome and the general expectation that he would do right by her. Mary's cousin had become, over the summer, genuinely fond of Clark in the way that good people become fond of other good people when given sufficient opportunity. The celebration afterward was held at the Marsh place and was a simple, genuine affair, good food and music from a fiddler Robert knew, and the easy warmth of a gathering of people who were genuinely glad. Clark and Mary drove home to their cabin in the last of the evening light, Mary leaning against his shoulder on the wagon seat, his arm around her, the mules Augustine and Jerome proceeding at their characteristic unhurried pace across the quiet dark prairie. The stars came out above them, that vast wash of light that had always made Mary feel small and comforted simultaneously. "We're home," she said, when the cabin came into view, lamplight warm in the windows where they'd left the lamp burning. "We are," he said. He said it with something in his voice that she recognized, the specific quality of homecoming, the word given full weight by a man who had not had a home to go to for 15 years. She took his hand. The first year on the land was the year of learning it, the way all first years on new land are learning its particular moods and tendencies, where it was generous and where it required more careful management, where the water ran true in a dry summer and where it did not. Clark took on the full seasonal position at the Hendricks Ranch, which gave them a steady income while they began to develop their own modest cattle operation on Mary's acreage. They bought a small breeding stock, 4 heifers and a bull, a practical beginning, and worked alongside each other on the land with the same productive compatibility they had found during the building of the cabin. It was not an easy life. No honest account of frontier ranching in 1873 could call it easy. The winters on the Kansas prairie were serious. The work was constant, and the margin between sufficiency and hardship was narrower than anyone who has not lived it can quite imagine. There were weeks in February when the wind came off the plains with a particular malicious efficiency, and the cold was the kind that gets into the bones and stays, and they spent those evenings close to the fire with the physical intimacy of people sharing warmth in a literal as well as every other sense. But there was a quality to those evenings, those difficult ones and the easy ones both, that Mary wrote about in her journal with the careful honesty she brought to everything. The particular rightness of being in a small, warm place with someone you love, while the world is cold outside. The way a difficult day becomes manageable in the telling of it to someone who listens with their whole attention. The specific tenderness that develops between two people who have helped each other through hard things. Clark was a man who grew into happiness gradually, as if he had to learn it in the same way you learn a language, starting with the basic vocabulary and building, over time, to fluency. She watched this happening and loved the watching of it. The set of his shoulders changed. The particular vigilance that had been always in his face began to ease. He laughed more. He had opinions about the cattle and about the weather and about the neighbor 2 miles west who was encroaching on the shared water access. and he expressed these opinions with an animation that suggested a man coming fully back into his own life. He had opinions about her, too, which he expressed in ways that were both direct and deeply felt, and she found that being loved by Clark Ashford was a very specific thing. It was not lavish or theatrical. It was particular and thorough and utterly consistent, the way the best of things are. In the spring of 1874, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning in the kitchen with the directness that characterized everything she did, and he stood very still for a moment and then crossed the room and held her in a way that she felt clearly in every part of her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said into his shoulder, "and very glad." "I'm glad," he said. His voice was thick in a way he did not try to conceal. "I'm more glad than I know how to say." "You're doing fine," she said. Their son was born in October of 1874, on a bright fall day with the cottonwoods along the Nineska burning gold outside the window. He was a substantial, healthy child with dark eyes like his mother, and a look of concentrated determination, even at 3 hours old, that made the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Garrett, say that this one was going to have opinions. They named him James Thomas Ashford James for Clark's father, Thomas for Mary's late husband, because she believed that love was not a diminishing resource, and that Thomas Finley had been part of the story that had made her who she was, and who she was had made this possible. Clark held his son for the first time with the particular carefulness of large hands holding something precious, and Mary watched his face while he did it. And what was on his face was something she had never seen there before, a complete and unguarded openness, all the careful watchfulness entirely gone, replaced by something enormous and gentle. "Hello, James," he said quietly, to the small dark-eyed face looking up at him. The baby blinked at him with the ancient gravity of the newly arrived. "He looks like he's evaluating you," Mary said from her bed, exhausted and warm and wholly content. "I hope he likes what he sees," Clark said. "He does," she said. "I can tell." The years that followed were full in the way that lives built by two capable and devoted people tend to be full with work and growth and difficulty, and the particular deep satisfaction of watching something you have built together become itself. The cattle operation grew steadily, not dramatically but soundly, as Clark's skill with land management and Mary's methodical financial sense shaped the enterprise from modest beginning towards something genuinely promising. James grew from the opinionated infant into an opinionated child with his father's eyes and his mother's directness, a combination that was occasionally trying and consistently delightful. He was 4 years old before he accepted that he could not come along on every ride, and even then he negotiated the exceptions with a persistence that made Clark look at Mary over the child's head with the expression of a man who recognizes something in his offspring and is not entirely sure what to do about it. "He gets it from you," Clark told her. "He absolutely gets it from you," she said. "That face he makes when he's decided something and will not be moved, that is entirely your face." "I don't make a face." "Clark," a pause, "perhaps a small face," he allowed. She laughed, and it was the warm, unguarded laugh that had always been the best sound in his world, and he reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his, because he could, because she was there, because after 4 years of waking up to her, he had not gotten over the specific luck of it. In the fall of 1876, their second child was born, another boy, which James, age 2, received with the resigned tolerance of someone who had specifically requested a dog and been given something else entirely. They named him William Robert, the Robert for Edna's husband who had been a steady friend and good neighbor, and William proved from early days to be an entirely different temperament from his brother, calmer, more observant, with a quality of stillness that he had clearly inherited from his father. "He watches everything," Mary said, looking at the baby one evening. "The way you do," Clark said. She looked up at him. "You watch everything," he said. "You always have. You walk into a room and you read it." He paused. "It's how you knew to come sit across the fire from me." "Is that what you think that was?" she asked. "Observation. And courage, he said. It wasn't courage, she said. It was interest. I was interested in you. From across a campfire with 20 other men around. From the moment I saw the space everyone had left around you, she said. The space told the story before you did. It said, here is a man who has been unjustly set apart. I wanted to know why. He looked at her in the quiet kitchen with their son sleeping in the cradle beside the stove and the wind moving across the Kansas prairie outside and the lamp burning low between them. And there was in his expression the full weight of everything, the 3 years of solitude before her, the journey south on the trail, every stick of that cabin built side by side, every hard winter and good summer, every conversation and every silence. I have thought often, he said slowly, about what would have happened if you hadn't come to that camp. I've thought about that too, she said. I would have gone to Ellsworth, he said. Done the work there, moved on again. Same circle, different counties, he paused. I don't know that I would ever have, he stopped. Come home, she said. Yes, he said, but I did come to that camp, she said, and you were there, and here we are. Here we are, he agreed. She got up from her chair and went around the table and sat on the bench beside him and put her head on his shoulder in the way she did when the words felt insufficient, and the closeness was the better language. And his arm came around her in the way it had been coming around her for 3 years of marriage and showed no signs of doing any differently. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with the sound of water, and the cattle in the pasture were quiet, and the lamp threw its warm light across the kitchen where Clark and Mary Ashford sat together in the particular peace that belongs to people who have found their right place. Edna Marsh died in the spring of 1877, which was a grief, though not an unexpected one. She had been ill through the winter with the kind of illness that does not reverse, and she had faced it with the same cheerful competence with which she had faced everything. Mary went to her every day in those last weeks and sat with her and talked to her about the small things and the large things in equal measure, and was with her at the end in the way she had learned to be present at endings. Robert was devastated in the quiet way of men whose practical competence does not protect them from grief, and Clark spent several days that spring helping him with the spring work that would otherwise have gone undone, not because Robert asked, but because it was the right thing and Clark Ashford had always known the right thing, even in the years when doing it had cost him. She would have had opinions about how I'm handling this, Robert said one afternoon when they were working the fence line together. She absolutely would have, Clark agreed. Good ones. The best ones, Robert said, and for a moment his voice went rough, and Clark let it be rough, the way you let things be what they are. The Marsh place eventually passed to a nephew of Robert's who came out from Ohio, a decent young man who kept the property working and who became a reasonable neighbor. Robert himself lived on the land for several more years, and Clark and Mary remained close to him, the friendship deepened by shared grief and genuine regard. The year 1878 brought a daughter, which James received with considerably more enthusiasm than he had extended to his brother, partly because he had by now concluded that brothers were unremarkable, but a sister was a novelty worth having, and partly because baby Catherine from her first days had a quality of charm that was difficult to resist. She was a bright, easy child with her father's coloring and her mother's expression, which was the expression of someone who has already thought the thought you were about to share with them and is deciding politely whether to say so. Clark called her Cat from the beginning, because the full name seemed to sit somewhat formally on something that's small and lively, and the name stuck in the family and remained hers. With 3 children and a cattle operation that had grown to 120 head, the land that had been Mary's 160 acres was now genuinely theirs in every sense, worked and known, and improved by years of care and attention. They had rebuilt the barn twice, added a proper stable for 4 horses, extended the kitchen garden to a size that supplied them, and gave them surplus to sell in Caldwell. The cabin that they had built together had been expanded twice, A full second bedroom added when James was 3 and a proper parlor when William was born. And it was a solid, comfortable house now with a porch across the front where Mary still wrote in her journal in the evenings, and Clark would sit with his coffee in the mornings watching the sun come up over the Ninesca bottom. Caldwell itself had grown considerably by 1878. The cattle trade had made it one of the important shipping points on the trail, and with commerce came people, and with people came the particular texture of a place becoming a community rather than simply a camp. There was a real school now, which James attended with the enthusiasm of a child who has inherited 2 bookish parents, and a proper general store and a doctor, and a newspaper that reported local events with the slightly embellished confidence of frontier journalism. Clark had built, over these years, the reputation that had been stolen from him on that day in the Indian Territory. Not through any dramatic gesture, but simply by being the man he was in the place where he was, for long enough that people knew him by what he did rather than by what someone else had said about him. He was known as a fair man, a reliable man, a man whose word was worth having. He sat on a water board committee with 3 other ranchers and negotiated the shared access agreement with the quiet persistence that characterized his best efforts. He was someone people came to when they needed a straight assessment of a difficult situation, because he had the quality of looking at things as they actually were rather than as convenience suggested. He did not think about this consciously. He simply lived forward, as Mary had taught him by example, not from the story behind, but toward the story ahead. On a warm evening in June of 1879, 6 years after they had sat across a campfire on the Kansas prairie, and a stranger had looked at him and refused to be afraid, Clark Ashford sat on the front porch of his home and watched his children in the yard below. James, nearly 5, was engaged in some complicated project involving sticks and a great deal of serious narration. William, just past 2, was following him with the devoted attention of a younger brother, who has decided that his elder sibling is the most interesting person in the world. Baby Cat, 8 months old, was in Mary's arms, having recently concluded a vigorous opinion about the injustice of bedtime that had now resolved into sleepy capitulation. Mary sat in the other porch chair with the baby against her chest, and the evening light was doing what it always did at this hour, turning the grass gold and the air amber, and the Ninesca was audible in the distance, that particular quiet sound of water moving over stones. "I've been thinking about the south pasture," Clark said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it too." He looked at her. "You want to fence it properly and run another 20 head," she said. "I've been running the numbers. We can do it this year if we wait until after the summer sale." "You already calculated it," he said. "I calculate things," she said unrepentantly. "You were going to get to it eventually. I got there first." He shook his head, but it was the expression he had when he was amused and would not fully admit it. "Can we afford the fencing?" he asked. "If we buy it in 2 stages," she said. "September and then March." "Yes." "Then we should do it," he said. "We should," she agreed. A pause. The evening settled around them. "Do you remember," he said, "what you wrote in your journal the night we met? That I was a man carrying a weight he hadn't chosen and hadn't put down." She looked at him with a particular quality of attention. "I remember," she said. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "about what you saw that night. And you were right," he said, "and you were also wrong a little." "Tell me how I was wrong." "You said I hadn't put it down," he said, "but I had been trying to. I had been trying for 3 years and I couldn't do it because," he considered his words, "because you need somewhere to put something down. You can't put something down in the middle of open ground when there's nowhere to set it. You need a place." She was watching him. "You gave me a place," he said simply. "That's what you did." Catherine stirred in her arms, made a small sound, and settled again. In the yard, James had recruited William into his project, which appeared to involve a small dam across the irrigation channel and a considerable amount of concentration. "You built the place with me," she said. "I only held out my hand." It was enough. he said. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, the ring he had put on her finger 6 years ago warm against his palm. She curled her fingers around his. They sat together in the falling light of a Kansas evening in 1879, on the porch of the house they had built, watching their children play in the yard below, with the cattle in the pasture and the creek in the bottom and the grass stretching out in every direction, wide and generous and theirs. The story that had begun with a woman who sat across a fire and said you look like you have a story had not ended, would not end, was in fact in its richest and most generative chapter full of the small daily material of a life shared, full of the mundane and the profound in equal measure, full of the work and the rest and the laughter and the occasional difficult evening, and the ordinary miraculous fact of two people who had found each other in the middle of a vast country and decided to stop moving. In the years that followed, the ranch grew steady and sound. The south pasture was fenced in 2 stages exactly as Mary had planned. The herd reached 200 head by 1881. James went to school and came home with books and long questions and opinions about everything, and Clark sat with him at the kitchen table in the evenings and read with him, and argued gently and with great pleasure about what they read. William developed, as he grew, into a boy with a particular gift for things that grew, for the garden and the pasture and the careful management of the land itself, and spent hours beside his mother in the kitchen garden with a seriousness that she found both charming and productive. Catherine, called Cat by everyone who knew her, developed the particular combination of her father's quiet strength and her mother's direct wit, and by the age of 4 was applying both to the management of her brothers with an efficiency that was both impressive and occasionally alarming. Clark Ashford was, in 1882, a man of 36 with sun lines at the corners of his pale eyes and a quality of settled contentment that had replaced the old vigilance entirely. The story that had followed him for 3 years had faded to nothing more than the occasional memory, an old thing that no longer had its teeth. The name that had carried its shadow now carried something different. The plain, good reputation of a man who did what he said, and said what he meant and treated his neighbors squarely, and raised his children with the understanding that doing the right thing when it was difficult was not optional but necessary. Mary Ashford was, in the same year, a woman of 32 with calluses on her hands and a clarity in her dark eyes that had deepened rather than diminished with the years, who still wrote in her journal every evening and still read her Dickens and her botanical guide with equal care, who still said things straight out without apology, and who still, after 9 years of marriage, made something happen in Clark's chest when she laughed. On their 9th anniversary, Clark found her on the porch in the last of the September light, her journal on her knee, her pen in her hand. He brought her coffee, the way he had made a habit of doing, and sat beside her in the other chair. "What are you writing?" he asked. She tilted the page toward him. He read, 9 years since the cabin on the Nineska, 9 years since we stood in the door frame and I held out my hand and he took it. The land is good. The children are loud and specific and entirely themselves, which is exactly right. James has the kind of mind that will take him somewhere particular, though we don't yet know where. William loves this ground the way Clark loves it, with a thoroughness and care that is beautiful to watch. Cat is already exactly who she will be. And Clark, as I have tried many times to describe him accurately in this journal, and I think the closest I have come is this: he is the man the world tried to make smaller than he was, and who came back to his full size not through any single dramatic act, but through the long daily work of building something true. Clark read this and was quiet for a moment. "I am going to argue with that," he said. "I know," she said. "Whatever I came back to," he said, "is because of you," she said, finishing the sentence the way she still sometimes did, not out of impatience but out of the fluency of 9 years. "You're going to say because of me." "Because of you," he confirmed. "We're going to disagree about this," she said. "Probably indefinitely," he agreed. She leaned toward him and he leaned toward her, and they were still for a moment, very close, the way people are who know each other thoroughly and have not grown tired of the knowing. "Good," she said. And in the big kitchen behind them, the lamp burned warm, and somewhere in the house James was arguing with William about something that required significant volume, and Kat was making her views on the argument known from a third position, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the wind moved through the grass along the Nineska, with the sound of everything being exactly as it should be. Clark Ashford, who had ridden into a camp one May night in 1873 as the man every other cowboy avoided, put his hand over his wife's hand on the arm of her chair and looked out over the land that was theirs, and thought that of all the stories a man could find himself in, this one, this particular, specific, hard one, luminous one, was more than any he had imagined and everything he had needed. And that the woman who had seen him across a fire and been willing to know him had given him the truest thing there is to give, the chance to become fully himself. He held her hand in the falling September light. She held his back. The prairie went on forever in all directions, as it always had, as it always would, wide and honest and full of the particular beauty of land that does not perform, that simply is. And in a small porch on 160 acres along the Nineska, two people who had found each other in the middle of it remained exactly where they had chosen to be, together and at peace and entirely, completely home.